Hello, my name is Carrie Miller. I am the Executive Director of HFLA, the Hebrew Free Loan Association. We are often asked at the Free Loan Association, why interest-free loans? And this is the time of year where we can best answer that question. So we are gonna talk about why interest-free today. HFLA's work is grounded in Jewish values of tzedek, tzedakah, and tikkun olam. These are core teachings that center on ethical action and the collective effort to make the world more just and fair. These are all the values that are part of HFLA's founding and that we are rooted into this day. Our work is also grounded in the tactical laws in the Torah that inform how we do our work. Parshat Mishpatim, the passage in Jewish scripture that outlines rules and ordinances found in Exodus 21:1 to 24:18, presents detailed laws for daily life. After Moses returns from receiving the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai, rules are set forth to help the people understand how to apply these abstract commandments to everyday situations. In other words, the Ten Commandments provide the foundational principles, while Mishpatim provide the nitty-gritty details for upholding these ideals in the community. That said, we are left with a few questions about the meaning of these rules and how they apply to our modern life. We get asked all the time why interest-free, and we often respond with the values and the rules from the Torah that guide our founding and our work, but there's often still a blank stare, sometimes from even within. We thought that it would be helpful to hear from an expert on these issues to help us better explain why we do what we do and what it means to us to offer interest-free loans in our community. To help us answer these questions, I am very excited to have with me today Rabbi Eddie Sukol. Rabbi Sukol is the founder of the Shul, Cleveland's open synagogue. He also serves as the rabbi at the Cleveland Clinic main campus on behalf of the Jewish Federation of Cleveland and was a member of the Ethics Committee of University Hospitals and the Pediatric Ethics Committee of Rainbow Babies and Children's Hospital in Cleveland for many years. His previous rabbinical appointments include service as the Hillel Director at Ohio University, the Director of Pastoral Care at the Montefiore Home and NCJW Hospice, now Maltz Hospice, and as a congregational rabbi. Welcome, Rabbi Sukol.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.
So we're going to try and start broad and work our way down. And first, we look at the text, examine the values it represents, and then discuss its real-world application. For those who are not familiar with the way the Torah has been understood over the years and how it's been applied over the years, some parts of the text, and I'm going to let Rabbi Sukol jump in here if I get this wrong. Some of the parts of the text are handed down and to Moses and are taken literally, and others have been studied over time and interpreted by rabbis to clarify and deepen our understanding. So I guess the first question is, how did the rabbis decide when these rules and laws were narrowly written and when to take a more expansive look?
So that's a wonderful question. I just maybe a small correction as we
Please.
begin. In Jewish tradition, of course, the entire Torah is given by God. So the way you describe it, it sounded a little like an either or, and the truth is it's a both and situation. There are different views about how the Torah came into existence. The traditional view is that it was handed to it was given to Moses by God in its entirety. But whatever your view of origins of the Torah, what certainly is true is that once the Torah, and more generally the remainder of the Hebrew Bible, the balance of the Tanakh, including all the books of prophets and the writings, once we had them, we began a tradition of interpreting them, of examining, exploring, studying them, and deriving meaning, and among other things, practical application of these stories, of these teachings, and of course of the rules and laws themselves. And that was a large part, as you indicate, of the beginnings of the rabbinic tradition, and that continues to today. That has never stopped. We are an interpretive tradition, so we begin with the text itself and its clearest, simple meaning. In that sense, we begin with a literal reading of the text, but that's a good starting point, never a stopping point. I like to tell people, you can start a good Jewish argument by quoting from the Torah, but you can't end an argument that way because we have literally thousands of years now of interpretation. And in some ways, what differentiates types of Jews is not so much our opinion of origins of the Torah, but rather how we interpret the
Yeah.
Torah,
Yeah.
because we can come to different conclusions. There is a certain sense of authority in Jewish tradition and consensus along with that. So, with any of the verses in the Torah, whether they're related to Jewish law, as the laws regarding that we find in this Parsha Mishpatim, or just narrative story, there are different ways to interpret and to understand them. And that process began a long time ago and continues in every way.
So when we're talking about HFLA and some of these other things that are in these passages, in these chapters, are we using, for this in particular, are we using the literal mishpatim, or are these things that have been interpreted over time?
Again, it's not an either or, but a both and, because the principles that guide HFLA's work are found quite literally in the Torah. I'm going to just read. I don't want to start quoting chapter and verse to you like a preacher too much, but it's useful here in the middle of the Parsha in chapter 22, verse 24. If you lend money to my people, to the poor among you, do not act toward them as a creditor, exact no interest from them. If you take your neighbor's garment in pledge, right, this is in other words some kind of collateral, you must return it to him before the sun sets. It is his only clothing, a recognition that those in need of some kind of assistance have limited resources. So if you take a man's coat as collateral for a loan, you have to give it back to him before the sun sets because it gets colder at night, right? These laws all come out of the Middle Eastern part of the world. They didn't have frigid Cleveland days like we're experiencing right now. So the daytime you could go around in shirt sleeves, but at night you needed it. It is his only clothing. You'll pardon the lack of gender sensitivity in the text and in the translation. It is his only clothing, the sole covering. In what else shall he sleep? So there you have it. You had interest-free loans. I mean, that's pretty literal. But applying that principle in the sense of a value, not in the sense of a debt, in applying that principle, we have, hundreds of years of interpretation. How do we do that? And that gets us into some interesting areas, which I think we're going to explore in a moment.
Yeah, and it sounds like these are meant to be literal. It's not that these are ideal law, these are practical laws, and this is how you uphold what we have been told about the commandments and how you live that out in your daily life.
Right. I would say it a little differently. They are practical laws, striving for an ideal, and that allows me to say what I wanted to bring up a moment ago, which is it's very clear from the Torah in its entirety and from Parshat Mishpatim as a really brilliant illustration of that biblical Judaism, and that has set the tone for the rest of the years of Jewish living, has a very communitarian spirit. There are lots of ways that one can live a rich, full Jewish life. There's one way in particular you can't do it. You can't really be a hermit and have a rich Jewish life where it's not a religious tradition or even a cultural tradition, ethnic tradition, etc. And it's all of those, but it's none of them for simply living a solitary individual life. We live in community, and that brings with it responsibility towards our neighbor and an obligation to our neighbor in how we treat them and the kinds of actions we take. And that's seen in so many areas. So we have this communitarian spirit where we have obligations, responsibilities to one another. Let me give a couple other examples beyond just making interest-free loans, and we're going to come back to that. We have an obligation to comfort the mourners. Where somebody dies in your family, and the community is supposed to envelop you and comfort you. That's the very basis of all of the customs around death and Shiva. We provide if there is a bride, and it could be a groom also, but it's usually spoken of in terms of language of a bride, who is indigent in some way. Perhaps she was orphaned as a child. We have to provide for a couple to get married. That's a communal responsibility. In fact, for hundreds of years, in Ashkenazi Jews living in Europe, there was a tradition that when there was a wedding in the community, not for an indigent bride, just a wedding in general for a member of the community, that before the reception began, the poor of that village or town were fed a meal first. Maybe it wasn't the lush, catered type of meal that the guests were getting, but the poor in the community had to be fed. In other words, everyone participated in the simcha, and the needs of those who may not have been invited but who were part of the community, they ate first, and then the festive meal following the wedding took place. We pray in a minyan, right? We have to have at least for certain prayers. You can pray individually to be sure, but for certain prayers, and there's a value to communal prayer, we have to have a minimum of 10 people. And that's what constitutes the minyan is our minimum requirement. If it's the obligation of parents to educate their children, if they fail to do so, the community takes over that responsibility. So these are just some quick examples of we live in community with one another, and we have to take care of each other.
So, one of the things I was thinking about is doing some research here is like, what is the vision of society that emerges from some of these laws? And it sounds like it is one to reinforce the communal component of it, but also to kind of make sure that your community stays together and doesn't, if I charge interest and I gouge my neighbor with interest, then that person doesn't want to be my neighbor anymore, and the community. So is that part of all of this as well?
It is. I want to clarify. If you have a system, an economic system in which you can't really lend money with any interest, you can create a system in which an economy can't thrive. Mm-hmm. People won't lend money. So there have been developed over the years, this is kind of practical application of Jewish law. There have been some workarounds created, and I don't think we're going to go into the details, but there have been some workarounds created that allowed there to be economic engagement between people within a community and between communities themselves. And that includes different types of philanthropic undertakings. For many years, Jews in Europe lived as minority communities surrounded by the larger Christian community. And for a period of time during the Golden Age, parts of Europe were under Muslim control, and we dealt with Muslims as our neighbors. And one of the questions comes up, if a church or a mosque was trying to raise funds to build something, could a Jewish merchant make a donation? I mean, Maimonides addresses this head on. It's an interesting question. And they came up with an answer which allowed, within certain parameters, donations to be made, perhaps not for the religious space of another religious tradition, but for the communal space. In other words, you can't pay for the sanctuary, but if there's a social hall, if there's a coat room, if there's, right, that you could make a donation in support of that. So we didn't want to in any way handicap relations within and amongst communities. And so there were some workarounds created, but particularly as regards our obligations to fellow Jews, there was some differentiation about that.
Yeah. I wasn't necessarily going to talk about, but we think about it too on a regular basis. People always think that we only lend to the Jewish community because we have Hebrew in our name, but we have sort of taken the broad interpretation of neighbor and brother and to my people, that as it's written in the text. And so it sounds though like that's over the years, as that has been contemplated, that's part of that there's a responsibility to the community, and as our community has evolved, so has our responsibility to support it.
Right. And as you're saying, there's historical precedent for this. I mean, I think that brings us to a point that you mentioned in your introduction, which we have to come back to, because as you indicated, it lies at the very core of why you do what you do. And it brings us to the whole principle of tzedakah. And, tzedakah, the popular translation, we think of tzedakah as giving charity. You have a little pushka, you have a little charity box in your home, you put coins in it, and when it's all done, you donate it to some worthy cause. Certain ones are specific to Israel, certain are for other things, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this is a wonderful learning opportunity. We have young grandchildren, and so before we light candles and start Shabbos every Friday night, we put a few coins out and we have them put it in the tzedakah box. It's not their money; they don't have money yet, but you get the idea.
Yeah.
But they're getting in the habit of putting coins in the tzedakah box. So tzedakah is charity, but it's much more than that. That's the point I wanted to get to. It comes from the root word tzedek, which has to do with justice, fairness, equity, righteousness. And so tzedakah, in its truest and most expansive understanding, is related to anything we do which brings righteousness and fairness and equity into our world. I would say it like this: tzedakah is anything that makes the world right and that keeps the world spinning properly on its axis.
Yeah.
We find elsewhere in Torah, later in Deuteronomy, in the final book of the Torah, the teaching tzedek, tzedek tirdof. It's one of the most well-known verses from all of the. It's in the hit parade of verses from the Torah. It's at the top of the hit parade. Tzedek, tzedek tirdof. Justice, justice, you must pursue. And the tzedek, tzedek, the repetition of the command. Anytime we have something repeated like that, we know it's for emphasis.
Mm-hmm.
It's to indicate how very important it is, but it's the concluding part of the verse that also is powerful. You must pursue. Pursuing bringing righteousness into the world is different than passively waiting for it to happen. It requires our righteous acts. It requires our involvement. And it's, as I say, it's active, not passive. You can hope and pray the world will be fair and just. But that's not it. You have to take action to make the world. Take affirmative action. And you have to be proactive in the manner and the things you do to bring about justice and righteousness. And tzedakah is, when I talk about this communitarian spirit in Judaism,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, tzedakah underlies all of that. And so that, by definition, can't simply involve our interactions with other Jews. It has to involve our interaction with all peoples, certainly Jews, but all peoples, whatever their background and set of beliefs or lack thereof may be.
Yeah. So I think you sort of getting to my last question, and many of these things are universal over time, over centuries, over across communities. Thinking about how we think about these laws that were written these centuries ago today, and how do we why is it so important? How do we fit into the world today that doesn't really, although many of us have these values at our core, when it comes to thinking about daily life outside these doors, it doesn't really work this way. So how do we fit in, and how does we maintain some of this today?
That's a wonderful question.
Right. This is the next iteration of.
I think the answer is this: that there are lots of things in Judaism which Jews today and historically we see ourselves in some ways as countercultural. Yeah. And there's lots of pieces of Judaism which don't necessarily fit into the large, don't seem to fit in. I think they fit in very nicely, but they don't at first blush seem to fit in to what goes on in the larger community. Let's just take Shabbat for an example, right? We live in a technologically driven go world, and for 25 hours every week we shut it all down, right? Mm-hmm. And even if we don't observe a Shabbat in a traditional sense, there are things we do on Shabbat to make it different than every other day of the week, to get away from our standard work, to get away from the act of creating things, doing things, making things, we put that aside. So I'm not advocating that we have to only live in a way that is adherent to Jewish law as understood by the Orthodox community today. I have a much more expansive view than that. There's lots of ways to observe Shabbat, but ignoring Shabbat and what comes with it is not one of the ways to observe Shabbat. I mean, that's an obvious statement. So we take a break from everything going on. We shut down um, our regular interaction, our regular involvements in the world, and we take a break from it. And we take beyond just Shabbat. We take time at holidays to be together as a community and as families, and to give ourselves time to celebrate together and to eat together and to pray together and to sing together and all, right? So that it doesn't that non-credit lending, to bring it back to HFLA, doesn't necessarily fit the model of world economics today. That's not a ding on non-credit lending. That really highlights its strength, right? We're running counter to what the culture is, because at the core of that is doing it in a way that embodies tzedakah, that brings about that justice, fairness, equity. And it's interesting. I just wanted to make a note as we're talking about this, that the verses I read, which was 3 verses, one way to study Torah is to look and see what surrounds a verse that you're studying. So it's interesting to look what comes right before. What's the verse before these 3 passages? What's the verse right after? I think you're going to find this interesting. Right before the 3 verses right before what I read, you shall not mistreat the widow or the orphan. If you do, my anger will blaze against you. So it has to do with right before the passage about lending without credit. It comes right after how we treat the most vulnerable in our community, the widow and orphan. And what comes right after it, one very straightforward verse, you shall not revile God, right? You can't curse God, speak ill of God in any way. So here you have a connection to the divine source of all life, we might say, from a religious standpoint. That comes right after, and right before, a connection to the most vulnerable in our society. And out of that, and in the midst of that, in between those 2 things sandwiched is, how do we treat people who have economic need, who we can provide for? Of course, what's so interesting about this passage and the work that you and your organization do is that it isn't charity in the sense of giving them money. There's value to doing that. I'm not knocking that. A lot of good work goes on because people are generous. But this is a way of empowering and enabling people by lending money in a way that lets them, get on their feet, build a business, do whatever it is, but recognize their human dignity, that they will have a responsibility to pay it back, both for themselves, but also to make those funds available for the next person who needs it. And that brings me back full circle to this communitarian spirit, that we don't operate on our own.
I will never respond to the question the same. That was really great. Thank you so much. And
thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, I think you have explained to me and to all of us what we do in a way that validates and really speaks to what we are trying to do in the community. And so I thank you for your time, and I thank you for sharing your wisdom with us. And we will come back to you in the future for more.
Thank you. It's a delight.